Hi friends, welcome to the NPTEL course Strategy and Technology Practical Primer. We are in week 4 with the theme of competitive strategy. In this lecture, which is the 16th in the series, we will have an overview of competitive strategy. The theory of competitive strategy was first proposed in 1980 by Professor Michael Porter, professor in the University of Harvard. The thought processes that were ingrained in the theory of competitive strategy were seminal, and they constituted together a key stream of thought focused on industry structure, competitive forces, and firm level strategy, besides covering several other factors. Though the book was written in 1980 and the thoughts were formulated in the 1970s, the theory remains a highly educative guidance on strategy and structure even today and would remain so in future as well. But there are certain issues relating to the theory of competitive strategy as propounded by Professor Porter. One, it does not directly address the effects of a volatile global economic environment, digital technologies which are disruptive, and the consequent changes in industrial structure. We have been experiencing over the last several years the impact of global economic forces and also the disruptive impact of digital technologies. These two explicitly need to be covered in competitive strategy. In this lecture, we will try to expand the scope and the scale of competitive strategy for firms and explore several interrelationships which have not been explored by Professor Porter in his landmark thesis. We also will present certain additional approaches for understanding competitive strategy in the contemporary industrial and economic environment. So we will integrate into strategy the economic factors on one hand and the technology factors on the other. The lecture series thus provides new constructs and frameworks that will be helpful for the contemporary as well as futuristic evolution of industries. These are the three books which Professor Michael Porter wrote. One, as I said already, competitive strategy. The second, competitive advantage. And the third, the competitive advantage of nations. The first book, Competitive Strategy, deals with this domain of strategy in the context of an industry and makes many foundational contributions. The second book, Competitive Advantage, discusses how a firm can build competitive advantage by applying the techniques of competitive strategy. And the third, the competitive advantage of nations, provides a national level strategic framework analyzing and hypothesizing how nations can build competitive advantage. Although two books have come after competitive strategy, the core concepts and constructs of competitive strategy figure in one form or the other in the subsequent two books. There have of course been many other contributions to the domain of strategy, notably from C.K. Prahalad, Gary Hamel, Michael Hammer and several others. That said, there is no set of books or works that is as expansive and integrated as Porter's in approaching the myriad complexities of strategy. These theories and these constructs provide us with several useful and powerful conceptual and analytical frameworks which could be applied to several industrial settings and several company contexts. The beauty of these frameworks lies in their simplicity and their near universal applicability. These are the other seminal works on strategy. Several authors, Chandler, Eckhoff, Ansoff, and Ome, to quote a few, contributed over the last several decades to lay the foundations of strategic management as a domain from the 1960s. Some of these books are Strategy and Structure by Alfred D. Chandler, Jr., Strategic Management by H. Iger Ansoff, Kenichi Ome's The Mind of the Strategist, The Art of Japanese Business, C.K. Prahalad and Gary Hamel, The Core Competence of the Corporation, The Future of Competition, Co-Creating Unique Value with Customers by C.K. Prahalad and Venkat Ramaswamy, and most importantly, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid by C.K. Prahalad. There are many other books as well. I would urge people who are interested in the domain of strategy to further inquire into these books and assimilate those concepts. Noted theorists and researchers, as I cited, began researching and hypothesizing on the interrelationships between strategy, structure, and related strategic management process even earlier to and in parallel with Professor Porter. Professor C.K. Prahalad proposed alternative viewpoints in equally thought-provoking books on core competence and other approaches of competitive strategy and socio-economic development. However, the works by Michael Porter are so universal and so simple that they still remain books of substance and books of continuous reference by theoreticians as well as practitioners in the field of strategy. Why is competitive strategy so important? Because the theory covers the industry and the firm in unusual totality and in an integrated manner. It tries to prime the thinking of the strategist to current and futuristic business environments. Although it was done in 1980, most of the concepts are applicable even today. However, the updation of the book and the work with reference to the contemporary economic development, particularly the economic volatility and the contemporary technological trends, particularly the digital trends, has not happened. Although the book has since been updated, the style and substance very much remain faithful to the original work. Porter identified 5 forces of competition, which I have referred to in earlier lectures, which we will again consider as a recap. Porter delineated how firms can respond to the competitive forces, develop competitive strategies, and how those competitive strategies can build value and strength for companies. He came up with the concept of competitive advantage, that is, the ability of a firm to derive superiority with reference to the competitors through the deployment of certain generic competitive strategies. These works remain as guideposts for strategists as the firms try to grapple with the pressures of competitiveness. To recall, these are the 5 forces that are applicable for any firm in any industry based on Porter's competitive strategy framework. First, the threat of new entrants. Second, the bargaining power of buyers. Third, the threat of substitute products or services. The fourth, the bargaining power of suppliers. And fifth, the intensity of industry rivalry. The firm is part of an industry and the industry itself is a part of the environment. As I said in an earlier lecture, Porter's 5 forces theory draws immensely on the structure, conduct, and performance theories of industrial economics. However, the way he correlated these forces, these economics, to live industrial and firm level situations made the work completely different and accessible and interesting for the practicing managers. In talking about competitive strategy, he made the second fundamental contribution in terms of generic competitive strategies. He proposed 3 strategies as generic strategies which could be applied by any firm. The first is cost leadership. Any firm that has cost leadership can ensure price competitiveness or earnings superiority or a combination thereof with certain industry trade-offs. Price competitiveness means a lower price relative to competitors, or keep the price as high as possible and have superior earnings. Both these options are possible when the cost is at the lowest level possible without any compromise to quality, of course. Differentiation is the second generic strategy. A firm that follows differentiation can achieve a superior market and price position based on a set of differentiated features of the product. It could be in terms of the performance, it could be in terms of the looks, it could be in terms of the form factor, it could be in terms of the reliability and durability, serviceability. There could be many features which could differentiate a product from some other product. Not only that, the way the product is delivered and maintained could also be a feature of differentiation. The third is niche or focus. A firm that follows a niche strategy seeks to adopt narrow product market strategies that are unique to the firm. Now, these strategies are so simple that they are universally applicable. So, given that there are millions of companies all across the world, and there are only 3 strategies, one may question oneself as to how these would lead to differentiation and competitive advantage for any firm. The answer to this lies in 2-3 aspects. One, these strategies are directional. That is, they are more in the nature of strategic philosophies, that I should have the lowest per unit cost. I should have the highest differentiation in my product or service. I should be very focused on target product or market. But how a firm undertakes the construction of that particular generic strategy is dependent on the firm's strengths, weaknesses, environmental opportunities and threats that the firm faces, and the way the strategy is constructed by the firm. We talked about inclusivity in the strategy formulation process, and most importantly again, the way the strategy is executed. We should therefore take these as strategic philosophies rather than some generic strategies which can be taken off the platter and then implemented. Every firm has to create its own strategy of cost leadership, its own strategy of differentiation, and its own strategy of niche or focus. Some companies even go to the extent of trying to have a mix of these 3 strategies in their product and business portfolio. The way it generally works is that one set of products will be known for cost leadership, one set of products could be known for differentiation, and one set of products could be for niche or focus strategy. Or businesses themselves can be construed based on cost leadership, differentiation, or niche. Any combination is possible, but the more complexity that is brought into the construction and application of these strategies, obviously the more challenging will be the leadership requirements in making sure that these competitive strategies are well aligned, well developed, and well executed. What are the factors influencing competitive strategy? It is a domain that is at the interaction of industrial structure and business performance. The firm shapes the industry, but also the industry shapes the firm. There are 3 classic requirements for understanding and developing competitive strategy. First, an understanding of the definition of the industry in which a firm operates in or would like to enter. Second, the levels of entry, exit, and mobility barriers within and across the defined industries. Third, strategies that can be deployed to achieve the strategic goals. Apart from regular operations, additional strategies such as integration, diversification, merger, acquisition, joint venture are all strategies that can be applied to strengthen the 3 generic competitive strategies that a firm can deploy. These factors together influence the competitive strategy of a firm. I would say the industry definition, the barriers within an industry, and the specific additional strategies that can be deployed by a company. However, for some strange reason, Porter's work has not accorded the due visibility and weightage to technology as a fundamental driver of competitive strategy. Technology, I would say, has to be the single most important driver of strategy. This course, I would believe, bridges this gap between strategy and technology. It connects strategy with technology and informs how technology embedded strategies can be far more effective than structure based strategies or just context based strategies. Why is technology a key driver of the 5 competitive forces? It may not act as a force directly which is visible, but it is a force that influences certain key forces very substantially. Particularly the threat of substitute products would not come up unless there is technology which is driving the development and manufacture and delivery of those substitute products. It is also a key factor in determining the way the other 4 competitive forces shape up. Buyers can become more discerning and more demanding once they understand the technology that is now available. So buyers will say that this is the kind of technology I must have. Once upon a time, the buyers in Indian markets were happy with the older generation products. But today, the buyers understand that technology is available in products globally and that technology provides certain additional benefits. So people are willing to pay that extra money to get the best possible technology. Secondly, technology, although it requires huge amounts of investment and generally tends to be cutting edge when it is first developed, quickly gets commoditized. And that enables several players to enter the industry. For example, if you want to develop a website, there are parts of the website that can be bought and added. If you want to be a digital learning platform, there are some tools that are available which can be deployed for you to be effective in terms of creating the overall educational ecosystem. Similarly, if you want to get into watch business, every aspect of integration of the operating software and the hardware, particularly in the digital watch system, is available off the shelf. So commoditization of technology has enabled. So the shift takes place from technology per se to the integration and deployment of technology within a new product. The third one, the suppliers of superior technology would be able to exert higher competitive pressure on the firm. That is, if proprietary technology is developed and made available by the suppliers through their new products, they would be able to influence the bargaining power of suppliers. And uniqueness of technology establishes barriers to entry or the ability to overcome the barriers. The threat of new entrants is one of the most important forces along with the other four forces. The barriers to entry can be established by ensuring that the technology that is deployed in the industry is cutting edge, and it is very difficult for newer firms to enter in the technology space. On the other hand, if the technology is dated, new entrants can come in with technology that is superior. So in whichever way you look at on these 5 dimensions, technology is the key driver of the 5 competitive forces. The intensity of industry rivalry, which is a weighted aggregate of these competitive forces, is thus driven by technology, even though Porter's framework doesn't explicitly mention and illustrate the power of technology. Let us look at a practical example of Porter's 5 forces model. I will illustrate this with reference to the Indian automobile industry. One of the paradoxes of Porter's competitive theory is that it is so well read and so well absorbed, but it is so little researched in terms of quantitative foundations, and it is not so well differentiated in terms of specific industry contents. I have specialized through my research in terms of applying Porter's competitive theory in terms of several hypotheses, and the results of the hypothesis were validated by actual structural and company level matrices. We will come to that later. But suffice it to say that we can look at the 5 forces model itself through the industry evolution prism. We have in the past, before this week's lectures started, looked at various aspects of strategic management, including industry evaluation, structural analysis, and strategy formulations. Now we are going to look at these 5 forces model in this lecture as applicable to an industrial situation, which is a real life industrial situation with which all of us can relate to. Let's take the Indian automobile industry, particularly the passenger car segment in the 1970s. We have these classic 5 forces. There was little threat of new entrants. The industry comprised only Hindustan Motors, Premier Automobiles, and Standard Motor Products. Each of the manufacturers was comfortable with the respective low volumes of a few thousands each. The government felt that under the socialistic regime, passenger car was a luxury item. So was the market's thinking about the passenger car. The second, the bargaining power of buyers. Customers had little choice. They could not say that this car is superior, therefore I would buy more of that. Availability was limited, so was the ability to favor any particular product on any particular ground. So despite the dated designs and poor quality of the passenger cars, there was very little bargaining power that the buyers could exert on the industry or the firms. There was no threat of substitute products or services. Even the two-wheeler segment was in the nascent stage. It was really not a very evolved two-wheeler industry that could take huge number of people from the passenger car segment to the two-wheeler segment. And of course, the segments are quite different between two-wheeler users and passenger car users. Similarly, public transport systems were not of that nature that they could take people away from personal transportation by cars. Therefore, the threat was non-existent. Existing manufacturers were not undertaking anything more than minor improvements, if at all. The Indian government's licensing policies discouraged new entrants, and this helped the industry lead a cloistered existence, but it was not helpful for the markets and the consumers. Then the fourth force, the bargaining power of suppliers, was also very little. Suppliers had little incentive to expand and compete. They just coexisted, a kind of live and let live kind of situation, as a passive component of the industrial ecosystem. As a result of these four forces being benign and passive, the industry rivalry itself was low. There were no big shifts in the market shares. There were no disruptive moves by any of the players. So that was the situation of the Indian automobile industry, the passenger car segment in the 1970s. It is actually the counter thesis of Porter's expectation of industries being active if there are intense competitive forces, and the assumption that firms in an industry would always try to leverage their competencies and try to win over the other players. Whatever happened in the Indian automobile industry in the 1970s was a complete counter thesis to Porter's thesis of competitive strategy. Let's look at the same industry, the passenger car segment, in the 1980s. At that point of time, the Indian passenger car industry began witnessing the first whiff of technological change in the form of Maruti Udyog Limited, which came in with technical and financial support from Suzuki of Japan. So it constituted the threat of a new entrant to the smug and ossified passenger car industry. The industry comprised till then only Hindustan Motors, Premier Automobiles and SMPL in low volumes. It started experiencing the scale and technology driven entry of Maruti Suzuki. The bargaining power of buyers began scaling up. Customers had the first notable choice of a new generation Japanese small car. But still, the bargaining power is not as what it would be in an evolved market. The stupendous success of Suzuki's small car has paved the way, however, for potential entry by new cars made by other overseas manufacturers, although any substantive entry had to wait till the 1990s. So the threat of substitute products or services began appearing on the drawing boards, if not in actual reality. Several firms which were sitting on the fringe were assessing the Indian market and the success of Maruti Suzuki to formulate their own strategic plans. Suppliers who had dated designs had little bargaining power. It was left to Maruti Suzuki to create an entirely new ecosystem of Indo-Japanese component makers. As a result of this mix of status quo versus progressive forces, the beginning of industry rivalry started happening. The importance of technology in starting the structural change in an industry is evident from the above example. But for the new generation technology that was brought in by Maruti Suzuki, the industry structure would not have changed and the need for a new type of competitive strategy would not have arisen. So the linkage between public policy, technology management and competitive strategy is very much evident from this example in this particular period of 1980s. Developments in the subsequent periods would only enhance and amplify this advantage. In the 1990s, significant changes started occurring in the Indian passenger car industry. Major expansions started occurring with new players such as Maruti deepening their position, creating new capacities and even additional plants, and new players upping the game in terms of technology, scale and range. The threat of new entrants began taking significant shape. The existing companies or the established companies of the erstwhile era, Hindustan Motors, Premier Automobiles and Standard Motors, began folding up their operations, and a sharp ascendance of Maruti took place. More importantly, a bevy of foreign car makers began entering India with names such as Ford, GM and Hyundai, leading the change in the 1990s. And also they charged on creating new capacities. In the same period, indigenous auto giant Tata Motors made a strong entry into the SUV and passenger car segment. The threat of new entrants began taking shape in a significant way. The bargaining power of buyers began to improve further. You could only choose between Maruti and the established car maker. Now you could choose between a Maruti and Hyundai. Similarly, you could choose between a passenger car and a sport utility vehicle. Therefore, with the appearance of modern cars in the larger or wider range, in other companies' stables as well as in Maruti's stable, the bargaining power of buyers began improving. Even then, the capacity was little lower than what the market could absorb. Therefore, the bargaining power was muted. The threat of substitute models certainly began appearing on the horizon, forcing the incumbents to expand the range with new models. Led by Tata Motors, SUV began appearing as a substitute for large cars. The shortage of suppliers who had the capability to supply components of modern designs, ironically, led to increased bargaining power by such manufacturers. I referred to this earlier also. When a key component gets to a short supply situation, ironically, the bargaining power of supplier increases. It happened at that point of time with the modern generation automobile components of the 1990s. It is now happening again with semiconductors when there is a global shortage which is constraining the production plans of the automakers and enhancing therefore the bargaining power of suppliers. With this, the industry rivalry began to take a firm shape in the Indian automobile industry. In the 2000s, there was a further evolution of the fast expanding domestic market. The foreign principals began to be willing to support exports as well. So the global scale and scope of the Indian automobile industry substantially changed. This decade was also epochal as Tata Motors made a huge overseas expansion by acquiring the marquee brands and assets of JLR, Jaguar Land Rover. In several ways, the 2000s were a defining period for the industry, with several other leading global automobile companies entering India or expanding their operations. Names such as Toyota, Renault, Nissan, Skoda, Audi, Mercedes-Benz were a few such players. And more recently, we have Citroën coming in. So this list was a long list that happened in the 2000s. Now the bargaining power of customers can be seen to be increasing significantly. The cars were higher in capacity. A full range from 800cc to 1600cc began to be available, and the introduction by Toyota of family and business friendly oriented SUV began to tilt the market in terms of SUVs. Although SUVs were available from Tata Motors, it is the entry of Toyota with its Qualis first and Innova next that made SUVs into a very significant market segment. The threat of substitute products became a strong reality. Both incumbents and new entrants began to compete with each other to introduce multiple products and multiple models. Maruti, the market leader of the 1990s, having as much as 90% of the share, began losing the share, though not volumes, and remained therefore a dominant player. The bargaining power of suppliers kind of moved up and down. As Hyundai and Maruti consolidated their captive supply base, the bargaining power of such exclusive higher technology component suppliers expanded and enhanced over other OEMs. As a result, regular suppliers such as TVS Group and Rane Group came into the new generation technologies in a big way, and they established newer facilities and newer supply bases to be able to meet the industry demand. So the bargaining power of suppliers went yo-yo. With scale, competitiveness and intensity of competition also increased. The five forces model thus came into full play in the 2000s, with certain companies exiting, for example Daewoo, and the market getting finally segmented for customer satisfaction. The 2010s were another great period when the Indian automobile industry achieved a global scale and stature, with the ability to create products with unique design language and facilities with frugal engineering. No one would have thought in the 1980s that Indian automobile industry would be of global rank and global standing, that an automobile designed and manufactured in India could be exported, but that started happening from the 2010s. The threat of new entrants reduced because all the players who could come into the industry came, and there was only adjustment rather than disruption. Competition within the industry, however, intensified because the players began jostling for space. So the industry moved from the growth stage to a maturity stage, but the attempt was to try for a competitive shakeout during this overlapping phase, which is one of the reasons why certain companies such as General Motors folded their vehicle operations and decided to be content only with component supplies out of India. So the flow of new entrants into the Indian passenger car industry ebbed in the 2010s, although Kia Motor entered the Indian industry while Citroën formed up its plan of entry. But these entries, which are ones or twos, was of very lower level compared to the entries that happened in the 2000s. The bargaining power of customers increased substantially because the choices were simply mind-boggling, and there were many products that were getting launched every quarter, and that helped the automobile industry expand its capacity, expand its volume range, although buyers started exerting greater bargaining power. The decade of the 2010s, particularly the later half, saw the emergence of electric vehicle movement, and that was a regulatory as well as planetary movement, I would say. Everybody understood and appreciated the need for combating climate change. The government of India also began formulating strategies in the decade of 2010s, especially in the later half, for promotion of electric vehicles on the roads. Some companies began developing electric vehicles as futuristic range. It was also obvious from whatever was happening in the global automobile industry that it was only a matter of time before electric vehicles took center stage. Many governments started legislating for low emission vehicles first and then zero emission vehicles next. The bargaining power of suppliers again was somewhat lagging the industrial development. The suppliers in India seem to lack the drive to transform into an electric vehicle component ecosystem. The bargaining power of imported battery suppliers and other discrete electric vehicle related components would be high. The indigenous segment of the supplier industry is going to have low bargaining power, whereas the externally based supplier system would have high bargaining power. That is how the five forces are shaping up in the decade of 2010s, with industry rivalry becoming intense. A practical example of Porter's five forces model in the 2020s gives an entirely different picture. In the 2020s, we had the challenge of economic and social lockdowns caused by COVID-19 pandemic. The highest level of production and productivity was achieved by the automobile industry, probably in 2017-18 and 2018-19. 2019-20 and 2021 have been years that probably could be seen as very negative for the automobile industry. Firstly, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which curbed the travel and social mobility, but also because of the semiconductor shortage and the rise in the commodity prices of key inputs, including steel. That did not stop the industry from beginning to make a transformational journey into an electric vehicle future. That is all competition is about. Competition makes firms offer better products even when there are recessionary trends. So with the emerging electrification that is likely to be more mandated than incentivized by the governments, there is every likelihood that there would be new players entering the Indian market. Tesla was the first pure play electric vehicle maker to incorporate itself in India in 2021. I would expect that there would be other pure play automotive makers coming into the country. Even in the two-wheeler industry, we have as many as 25 electric vehicle makers gearing to get into this business, and therefore there will be early fragmentation of the industry with the new entrants, although Ather and Ola have been the early pioneers. The bargaining powers of buyers could be varying. Customers are likely to be confused on the way to take because the structure of incentives that are offered for electric vehicles, the type of service operation that would be offered by manufacturers, and the user experience of an electric vehicle would be influencing the demand for electric vehicles. So customers may be befuddled whether to go electric or to stay with conventional vehicles. The bargaining power of customers anyway would be higher because there would be opportunity. The threat of substitute products or services would also escalate. Between 1970 and 20, the threat of substitute products has merely been in terms of superior products in the IC vehicle range. However, going forward, the decade of 2020s will see a host of green energy options. Every known segment will have the green alternative that is available. Not only that, these would not be merely electric battery vehicles. There will be hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicles. There will be ethanol powered vehicles, CNG powered vehicles, and LNG powered vehicles. So this would be the trend that would happen in terms of development of substitute products and services. The advent of electric vehicles, including hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles, will necessitate a completely new and transformational component ecosystem. It will also require a transformational support system by way of charging stations, battery swapping stations, and so on. Those suppliers and vendors who would dominate this new generation component supporting infrastructure will enjoy high power. So given this constellation of the new forces, the industry rivalry will be intensified in the decade of 2020s. Structural analysis of industries and competitive strategy of firms thus assume an entirely new color and depth when transformations at industry level and game-changing strategies at firm level are enjoined. So now that we have seen the growth, development, and competition in the Indian automobile industry over these decades, let's see by putting across in one graphic how these things move. 5 forces and competitive industry in the Indian passenger car segment from the 1970s to 2020s is the summary of this graphic. In the 1970s, the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of buyers, the threat of substitute products or services, the bargaining power of suppliers, and the intensity of industry rivalry were all at a very low ebb. If one were to apply a scale of 0 to 5, everything would be at one level. That is the lowest level possible from an industrial mechanical point of view. But in the 1980s, certain forces started escalating. Except for the bargaining power of suppliers, all the other forces moved up a bit. That is because some companies tried to bring in some improvements to their products through import of other aggregates like Vauxhall engine and gearbox. Contessa body makeover was brought in by Hindustan Motors. Premier Automobiles tried to bring in a new engine option and tried to redesign the body with some cosmetic changes, but they were not substantial. As a result, the bargaining power of suppliers also was not changed. It's all the same. But in the 1990s, the forces started escalating. Particularly, the threat of new entrants escalated, and the bargaining power of suppliers also increased. The intensity of industrial rivalry reached a higher level. But the threat of substitute products was low, so was the bargaining power of buyers. In the 2000s, there was further increase, particularly in respect of the threat of substitute products and the intensity of industry rivalry. 2010 saw a more or less similar situation with reference to the 5 forces. But in the 2020s, we are seeing that the intensity of industry rivalry is going to reach a crescendo because of the increase that is going to take place in terms of the new entrants, especially in the electric vehicle space, and also the increase in the bargaining power of suppliers as well as the threat of substitute products. As I said, the buyers as a group would be befuddled with the kind of direction they should take, and I would expect their power to be at the same level as in the decade of 2010s. We can have different judgments on the intensity of these competitive forces, but definitely this provides a benchmark for us to assess the industry on a longitudinal basis. It is possible to quantify each of these forces and develop matrices of industry evolution and competitive intensity. That is how we can provide more sustenance and sustainability for Porter's theory of competitive strategy. We should also recognize that different forces have different intensities at different time periods. As the industry grapples with the challenges of zero-emission vehicles, the bargaining power of suppliers escalates, for example. When we look at the summation of all these competitive forces, you can see that the evolution of the automobile industry, especially the passenger car segment, from the time of the sole dominant firm in the 1980s to the multiplayer competitive dynamics of the 2020s, the competitive index grew threefold. 1970s, the aggregate competitive index has been 5, increased to 9 and to 13 in the 1990s. In 2000s and 2010s, it was static at around 17, but in 2020s, it has gone up to as much as 24. The theory of competitive forces is therefore conceptually sound and is practically relevant. It certainly qualifies as a valuable tool for analysis of competitive strategy at the firm level and at the industry level. It is a unique contribution by Professor Michael Porter, but we need to take it beyond simplicity and universality to the application of those simple concepts into powerful practical evidences of industries growing as per the theory and also firms responding as per the competitive strategies. So, having looked at the structural analysis and related constructs not only in this lecture but in the previous lectures, let's look at the second fundamental contribution of Michael Porter in terms of competitive strategy. I said that there are three strategies which he has prescribed: cost leadership, differentiation, and niche. A firm that has cost leadership ensures price competitiveness for itself or earning superiority. It works both ways, or in a combination thereof with certain interest rate trade-offs. A firm that follows differentiation can achieve a superior market and price position based on a set of differentiated features. And a firm that follows a niche segment strategy can adopt narrow product market strategies that are unique to it. Cost leadership strategies may earn industry average or slightly above industry average returns. Differentiated companies earn industry superior earnings, whereas niche focus could be having the highest level of earnings provided they also back themselves up with differentiation or cost leadership as appropriate to their products and market segments. Firms are therefore recommended to follow one of the three strategy approaches or combinations thereof. When you do these strategic planning in terms of generic competitive strategies, we have to also recognize that no one strategy endures throughout the life cycle of a product or throughout the life cycle of a business. We have to keep altering the generic competitive strategies based on the structural analysis of the industry as also the evolution of competitive forces as we have seen in the past. If differentiation was the driver of passenger car entrants in the early years of new entry, they would need to move to cost leadership as well as differentiation in subsequent years. Some companies may choose to be in niche area, for example, Mercedes-Benz. It may like to be in the premium segment. Similarly, Audi could remain in the premium segment and so on. Professor Porter also proposed that firm-level competitive strategy and industry structure are interrelated. The definition of the industry in which a firm operates and the levels of entry and mobility barriers within an industry and across defined industries influence competitive strategy. So, when a company has strategies of integration and diversification within an industry, these influence and are influenced by the five forces. Because whenever you set up your own in-house manufacturing capability, when you integrate either forward or backward, the bargaining power that is exerted by the buyers or suppliers respectively is impacted. Similarly, if you want to integrate outside the industry, then also there is entry impact on the other industry. So strategies of integration and diversification within an industry are influential in respect of the bargaining powers. In a manner of speaking, Porter's theory of competitive strategy represents the domain that is at the intersection of industrial structure and business performance. As we have seen in his expansive work, he lists several factors that influence strategy and structure. He also contributed in terms of developing models of competitive strategy that are relevant to different phases of industry evolution. Generally, competitive strategy as proposed by Professor Michael Porter makes very good and interesting reading. However, our skill as readers and practitioners, as learners, lies in applying that competitive strategy in terms of quantitative indices, in studying our firm, our industry, and the evaluations thereof in terms of matrices which can reflect the competitive strategy. We have to therefore take the 5 forces model as well as the 3 generic strategies as overall philosophical guides of structural analysis and strategy formulation, and see how they can be contextualized to the firm and the industry that we are in over a time span. And this is well illustrated by the Indian passenger car industry, which we have discussed. We can further segment the decade of 2020s in terms of our anticipation of how the firms will shape the industry, how regulatory policy and technology will shape the industry, and therefore how we have to toggle between different types of competitive strategies as we try to go forward in applying the theory of competitive strategy. That's our challenge. The structure and strategy, I would therefore say, is an enduring thesis. When we look back at the evolution of strategic theory, from Chandler's pioneering studies of strategy and structure to Porter's creative works of structural analysis and competitive strategy, a lot is available for theoreticians and practitioners in the domain of strategy to systematically study the industry structure and develop a firm strategy. The propositions arising from this are as follows. 1. Porter's strategy framework is enduring but can be made more robust by integrating economic and technological forces. 2. The 5 forces model is relevant in delineating industry level competitive forces and industry level. We can feel with quantitative indexes as to how this 5 forces model applies to each industry and how it varies across the time zones. The model certainly needs to be linked to evolutionary phases of the industry. The third point, which is an interesting feature, is that regardless of the structural complexity of an industry, there are 3 generic competitive strategy philosophies that can be commonly deployed. Even if there are several companies within an industry, they can formulate 1 or 2 of these strategies for themselves. However, the context by which these strategies get developed and deployed would make all the difference along with the execution of those strategies. In the forthcoming lectures, we will explore how Porter's excellent conceptual and analytical framework can be further adapted and reinforced to respond to dramatic shifts in economic and technological environments. Thank you. We will meet in the next lecture.